Hi. Thanks, Stan, for organizing this. It's really great to be back talking about blockchain. To be honest, I haven't been in the blockchain area for the last 2 years. So I sort of like escaped from the ICO's tokenization moment of blockchain. The project I'm going to present today is a project I run with another fellow. So I'm, as Stan said, I'm an entrepreneur and a researcher. So I worked at a crossover of digital ethics, Africa, development, and education. And the project I'm going to present, I built it with someone called Primavera de Filippi, who is also a researcher in law and IP. And intellectual property, sorry. And we, Primavera and I, 3 years ago, we started to discuss blockchain. She was a convinced blockchain activist. She was part of the Ethereum community and like completely convinced that it would bring development, democratization, and a whole new range of application that everybody would embrace. And I was starting a business in Africa called Africa for Tech, related to education and technology and innovation in Africa. And so we co-organized some blockchain workshops in Africa, and we worked together on that project, Buck. I'm going to mention a little later. And then the, I don't know, like the wave of like ICO and tokenization just like emerged us, and we just left it where it was. So the way I'm going to describe this project today might sound a little like old-fashioned maybe, because I'm definitely not part of that community today of blockchain activists and education, and and tokenization. So just to summarize, I work for a startup called Open Classrooms. We do education online training around digital skills, and we have a reflection around credential management and the change and the switch from traditional education systems toward skills-based and competencies-based model is also something to be explored with blockchain application. So in that project that we did 2 years ago, from 2015, 2016, project called Buck, we came across a number of institutions such as the OIF, which is the French Francophone organization, Francophone International Organization, and a number of national libraries across France, Canada, and Africa, Ivory Coast. The question that we wanted to raise at that moment was that there's a number of underserved needs in Africa when it comes to content and digital content specifically. First of all, the lack of infrastructure, of course, makes it very hard to have access to content. And not only in terms of like having an internet connection, because of course you have to consider that most of content access point in Africa are mobile, sorry. But also in terms of like distribution networks and like a clear framework for operations. So that clear framework relates also to IP, of course, and IP management, which is a very sensitive topic, considering that most of African writers, for example, have to be published in France, in the UK, or in the US before being able to be even like published and read in their own countries. And the same happened in the music industry. The movie industry being a little different because there's a number of kind of like Bollywood, like the Nollywood in Nigeria industry. Just an anecdote for you to have in mind and understand the complexity of content management and access to content in Africa. You may have heard of internet.org, the Facebook-based initiative run along with local telcos to distribute zero data plans, and those zero data plans, of course, enforce net neutrality because what they do is traffic prioritization. So the traffic prioritization means that you have a free data plan which allow you to have access to, let's say, Facebook and Wikimedia, because they're not evil. So they want, you know, people to be able to have access to public resources. And what happened with Facebook Zero Data Plan, for example, in India, Facebook was actually fired by the regulator. And India said, no, we don't want your Zero Data Plan because we do have, although we are developing countries and emerging country, we do have net neutrality principle, and you have to respect that. And in Nigeria, the problem was a little raised differently, which is also very interesting. What happened in Nigeria is the government let Facebook distribute the zero data plan, but after a while they realized that the people were using Facebook private groups plus Wikimedia storage and hosting capacities to share pirate movies from the Nigerian film industry. So they had to shut down the Facebook Zero Data Plan, not for net neutrality principle, but for the safety of their own film industry. So I think it's a relevant anecdote to a story to have in mind. So Buck is a blockchain-based platform to register works of art, cultural works mostly, and public domain art. We run this project, as I said, with different national libraries for the public domain work, and also with Creative Commons. And I'll come back to Buck later, but I wanted to start with a short introduction about blockchain and like trying to understand whether blockchain is looking for problems or is looking for solutions. And I think it's important to have in mind, and especially since I was, you know, barely a blockchain expert. I just was interested in the possible implementation and the possible solution that it would bring to some real communities and local communities in Africa at the moment we did that project. So just in, you know, theoretically talking, I think, and I'll move fast on this aspect because I think we've heard enough experts today that gave a very good, you know, overview over what blockchain means and how it works technically. And I don't know who is today here, but I'm sure you already have a little bit of understanding of how blockchain and cryptograph and crypto in general works. But I think it's important to keep in mind again that one of the characteristics of blockchain is working around attribution and the ability to trace. It's been said several times today, who did what and when, and to register inbound events on a chain of blocks, basically. So what that attribution characteristic means in terms of application and possible implementation of blockchain, which is the subject today, rely also on a very important concept, which is a proof of existence. Proof of existence is basically the hashing of documents, the ability to register the proof of existence of a document as such, and to encrypt it. So that's proof. If you applied those two principles of attribution and proof of existence to the education sector, but also to all kind of content sector, I just wanted to introduce a couple of examples of what's going on in the educational sector around that attribution and proof of existence capacity of the blockchain. For universities, for example, it means a possibility to develop the equivalent of open badges, basically. So meaning that you can actually register on a blockchain not only the diploma and the credential and the certification of your student and their evaluation, but also the possibility of just checking who came to visit what, who actually read what, and how this means that you are learning and developing competencies and skills. And this is very relevant in an era where education is radically changing from a diploma and like clock hour, model of education and certification and credential obtention to a skills-based and competencies-based and lifelong learning education. So in the credential management area, there's the possibility through blockchain, and thanks to that attribution and proof of existence characteristic, to move from final diplomas to ongoing skills and capabilities and competencies, meaning that an educational journey can start from point A to point B being completely undetermined and not only in the on a time frame of couple of years, and the educational milestones could be in constant interaction with the different background of a single user. So credential management for people is already something that has been revolutionized by peer-to-peer, and basically the platform generation of professional competencies and learning. So if you take, for example, the peer-to-peer university or even LinkedIn, the possibility to have the recognition and the evaluation of your capacities and your competencies by other people is existing. It has been existing for a long time. The problem is whether you can take these credentials and these capacities recognized by a community of peers toward to another platform and validate that these competencies that have been validated by LinkedIn can also work in another environment, and mean that you as an individual and the users can actually build a personal competency backpack. So with the blockchain, you could actually imagine that the credential and the diploma, the competencies are actually relying on a decentralized decentralized chain of blocks that allows you to move from point A to point B, crossing many other environments during your educational journey, and involving many different actors, and actually still keeping the integrity and the traceability of your competencies and skills. If I'm going too fast, or if it's too just like interrupt, don't hesitate to interrupt me. I was told by Stan that it was supposed to be a conversational sort of presentation, so I'm happy to, stop in the middle. So for credential management for educational resources, it's of course mainly focused on certification and attestation, and the equivalent of diploma, or micro certification, micro degrees, and for example, some MOOC platform will call nano degrees for a certain piece of knowledge that you can actually assess as such. Coming to BOK, so because our idea, and I'll present what we did, and I would like to engage really in a sort of like conversation or just brainstorming around what could be done from like moving from resources management and IP management towards credential and lifelong educational journey management, if some people in the room are interested. So BOK, I explained, is a platform that allows to register works under Creative Commons or public domain art, public domain works on a blockchain. Why is it useful? The problem of assessing the legal status of digital works published on the internet is something we've been discussing since this morning. So I guess you will have an understanding of that question today. It's not night yet, but so the reason why we were interested in like approaching that question with Creative Commons or public domain was that Creative Commons at its creation refuses very clearly to create a centralized database of the licensing. And why they did that is that, of course, they didn't want it to get involved with the monetization of the free licensing as possibility that they were opening. The other problem is that for public domain art works, they're very difficult to identify in an international background, because you may have some public domain time frame in certain countries or certain region. And there was an example, for example, of the drawings of Le Petit Prince from Saint-Exupéry being still under copyright in France, but not in Canada. And this created a lot of nightmares for for institutions and stakeholders and right owners. So Buck used technology to fulfill the objective of building a shared registry collecting work license under Creative Commons or public domain works. It was very important, so it's not specifically mentioned in the slide, but we really worked on the African continent as a use case. We wanted to, tackle the difficulty for African creators and institutions as well to be able to have access to the distribution network of digital content online. And one of the aspects of that was, of course, going through the gratuity of the content. So that's also why we looked at the public domain and the licensing, the free licensing of Creative Commons. So we worked on, we created a blockchain, so the sort of distributed database with the following characteristic. First, it's tamper resistant, so the data can't be modified once it's recorded, once the hash and the proof of existence has been emitted. It's decentralized, no single actor can control it. It's transparent, the data is freely accessible for all. So we used that with Creative Commons, and I'm sure you are familiar, but I'm happy to, actually this is in French, so I'm happy to maybe explain a little bit further of the difference of licensing under Creative Commons, which is not necessarily just non-commercial. You can actually license content with Creative Commons, and it was actually one of the thesis of Creative Commons at its creation was to be able to commercialize content with and protecting content on the internet. So you have a characteristic of attribution, one of commercial or non-commercial attribution, modification or non-modification characteristic, and one last license that will express whether the condition of sharing are, if you need to share in the same condition, if you can actually allow some reuses or some remixes and etc. So this is Creative Commons licensing 4.0, by the way, and it's been constantly revised. So we use the technology of Ascribe, which is something I'm sure you have heard of if you've been in the IP management and content business, which is now unfortunately not running anymore. So the mortality of application in the blockchain world is quite quite impressive. But Ascribe was one of the first platforms using Ethereum to be able to register IP and manage IP throughout different media industries. So Ascribe was providing proof of existence, versioning functionalities, non-repudiation, meaning that they were making sure that nobody could repudiate you from being the owner or the creator of a content. Third-party certification, which in the in the case of cultural industries and education industry is very important, because the notion of, who actually legitimate the archive, who legitimate the diploma, is something very, very important. And finally, the possibility to assess unique editions, which could be tokenized, basically. But we never talked about tokenization when we built that application of IP management. So the way it works, one aspect is a registration of the work, the other is the consultation, the possible consultation of the work. So BOK was powered by Ascribe. We managed to convince a couple of institutions, national libraries and museums also, to register the works on Ascribe, either through an API, just like API matching, but or fetching. We also convinced a couple of creators on the continent in Africa, some musicians, we didn't go through usual distribution networks because they're very few, actually. Like, record labels don't really own their IP or outside of a very small geography in Africa. So since we were very targeting at offering an internationalization of that, we talked and discussed directly with artists. And the documents were all stocked on IFPS, which is still being run, and the metadata fetching was made by MediaChain. So BOK was powered by Ascribe, allowing third party to certificate whether a work was part of the public domain or not. And there were different levels of certification and ability to certificate whether you could confirm what ownership and what status a work could have through comments, through signature, etc., etc. So what's next? Because we did that for a certain purpose 2-3 years ago, at a moment where blockchain technology was also, or the blockchain ecosystem was slightly different. And we still have in mind to keep that platform to certify the legal status and quality of content on the internet, which is basically the mission. But in middle term, working with Creative Commons resources, licensed resources, continue to trace the evolution and remixes of Creative Commons works. And long-term, looking at whether we can build better recognition to contributors for quality works through the mechanisms of attribution, repudiation, and etc. So the different areas we are looking at for developing BOK as an application and implementation are still public domain works, cultural works, and Creative Commons licensed works, and open educational resources. And I will probably focus on these last two this last point for the couple of minutes left. So open educational resources needs credential management, and I think it's fairly relevant if you have been following any online education. I don't know if some of you have, but you are always struggling with whether the content you're looking at is relevant for your journey, for the assessment of your competencies and skills. The good thing about open educational resources is that they are easy to find. They are most of the time clearly described, so the metadata are pretty okay. The quality of data is quite okay. Most of the time they're also clearly licensed and they come from trusted source. The problem that they face is that they need to really offer more traceability when they are being used for other purposes. Let's say you're taking a JavaScript development course and you want to integrate that in another curriculum of, I don't know, to become like a a content producer. So how would you be able to like trace that this specific course will coming from this other path will allow you to become a good content producer or content manager? Then, of course, the problem of attribution and compensation is very much discussed with when it comes to open educational resources. So they're widely spread over the internet, but it's really difficult to assess the quality, as I said. And so BOK would be an ideal proof of concept, and it's running. It's been efficiently applied to both find, locate the resources, understand their quality, curate them, remix, or attribute them to the right people and get them recognized and rewarded. And see, I'm not using any token or ICO or concept to think about the application. So we can either trace the attribution and the evolution of the resources and the educational resources, bear in mind that it could be also any kind of resource. The quality and the certification of this resource, and the compensation, meaning ex post, meaning their monetization. So the tracking and attribution and evolution of the content over the internet, thanks to powered by BOK, would be you have like one line of like original content being with its proof of existence, and so that the purple line. And then let's say someone, the University of Shanghai, would like to translate that MIT course being, distributed, or one of the Khan Academy course. And Shanghai University translate the concept, the course, and then from that specific translation, someone would use it for remixing to integrate it in a different educational path, let's say, to become from moving from like Java development to content producer. And in the meantime, someone else would use like a certain part of that path to become a Java developer, to tweak it into another path. So this is the first aspect and feature that such application can allow and trace. The second is the quality and the certification. So this is where the third party are being involved for assessing the quality and certification. You could basically add all the ecosystems that I mentioned earlier when I was speaking about competencies and lifelong learning. So you could add them at any point of the hashing of the proof of existence and make them like the decision maker, or give them a certain like level of decision making in this application. And the third aspect is, of course, the monetization, and whether you can like redistribute some financial resources that would be associated with the content itself. And it may sound weird, because in a moment and in an era where we're all about raising money for applications that don't exist yet, but you would be surprised to hear that a lot of the Creative Commons work actually are sometimes asked whether they can be rewarded with financially rewarded because the quality of the work is being really appreciated post creation, without having the possibility to do so. So this is one of the aspects that is also important to bear in mind, especially in an education background. So in other terms, and to summarize the BOK project as such, today we are thinking and discussing with different beneficiaries, such as creators, institutions, users, and general public. And we would be really interested in opening that conversation towards whether how complicated this implementation could be. from the experience we had, it's not so much a question of it's not so much a question of like whether you need a lot of funding or whether you need a lot of technical skills to do so, because they're more and more available. I think it's whether you have a clear understanding of the different stakeholders you want to get involved into your project for building this. So I'm open for any question or discussion or things.
Thank you. Okay, I have a question. I always have a question. So we Estonians really like to complain all the time that, you know, we can't do things and there's less money and oh, someone's calling me. That's your tomorrow's meeting. Let's talk a little bit about institutions, because there's a lot of discussion, for example, around Film Archive. I'm seeing Eva sitting there. There's a lot of things around National Library. There's actually the music resources of Estonian National Broadcast and Radio, and etc. So what was kind of the biggest hurdle, or how actually you got the institutions on board? Because usually if you go and talk to, I'd say like a public sector, you know, culture workers in libraries or education and so forth, then it's like, no, we can't do it because.
So to be honest, having the Creative Commons community was very useful, because for a lot of them, I mean, you need to, of course, identify who are the geek inside the institution, but having, you know, the Creative Commons have already worked a lot with institution and did a lot of like evangelizing. So, and we were not so much coming with, you know, saying, hey, this is blockchain-based technology and this is revolutionary. We were mostly focusing on what would be the pain and the gain for them, I would say, you know, like, so it's not, it is definitely, and I don't know how, there was a cultural component and a historical component today, because blockchain has both lost and gained the sympathy capital it used to have. So it's sometimes tricky to, you bring blockchain in a conversation and everybody gets like, wah! Or on the contrary, you're really like excited, and you know, it's not, I would say really focus on what the real gain for someone who is an archivist, someone who is dealing with IP management for a long time, or someone who is dealing with educational resources, and like the timing of that is really also important, I think.
Super. Jake.
I'm curious, you brought up pain points in terms of consuming content in Africa, and is just access to internet and data still an ongoing pain point?
Yes, of course. I mean, it's not in most cities. So what's going on in Africa today, that you have a real like discrepancy between cities being pretty okay and like connected with, you know, fiber, and then the rest of the continent, and 60% of the population in Africa is still living in the countryside, so in rural areas. So one of the key issue for such applications will be definitely the access to internet and mobile access, and of course also the energy consumption, which is still. We had a very interesting application case we worked on with transactive grids in Kenya. So transactive grids, for those who know or don't, it's a blockchain-based energy systems that, you know, allow to a community to share the production of energy, of solar panel-based energy consumption and distribution. It's like micro distributing the energy, and so we worked on how we could bring that kind of scenario in Kenya and in Morocco, and it was actually really efficient in terms of use, and like very adapted to the use. There the problem was more about regulation, which is something we haven't spoke of. But I think beyond, I wouldn't say that the access to internet is of course an infrastructural issue, but it's getting solved more and more. But the problem of regulation is the same as in Europe or the US. I think that's it.
I had a question here.
Yes.
It's not specifically about your platform, but about a lot of these content registry platforms generally. I liked that you said, you talked about proof of existence rather than proof of ownership, because that's something that you can't really claim to do. There's a famous story, I can't remember which content platform it was, that someone said, yes, you can upload all your works and you can say exactly what rights people have on them. Someone uploaded a Mona Lisa, and they said, I created the Mona Lisa. And it was there on the blockchain forever that this person had said that they created the Mona Lisa. Obviously, that's crap, but it means that you have to have a lot of sort of governance mechanisms for people to be able to complain that they say, no, this person said this at this time, but it's not true. So do you have some sort of board that people can complain to that can then try and verify, or do you just say that's not our problem, we just verify that this person said that they had the rights over this, and it's up to you to decide whether that's really true? Do you address that issue?
Absolutely, and that's also why we wanted to give the third party the ability to either certify and actually create a proof of existence, but also comment on other people. Proof of existence and registering on the blockchain. So for example, let's say you're the son of Saint-Exupéry, or the grandson, or grand-grandson, and you want to claim that you own a certain copy of Le Petit Prince, and you would be, in other terms, you would be able as an individual to register it on the blockchain. But we will also automatically ask some of the third-party registered on the blockchain to, they would have the right to comment and not necessarily forbid you from registering. We can't forbid anyone from using the blockchain, but at least keep a trace of other people's interaction with that or consideration around the proof of existence. Yes, it's very relevant for us to really consider proof of existence and not ownership.
Is there any kind of reward for the people who are verifying that, or are they just doing it as part of a community because it's in the interest of the whole community to verify?
So we didn't reach a point where we had a large community enough, so we were working with just a couple of institutions, but it's definitely a point that would need to be deepened, I think, whether, how do you, so the incentive for the institution is pretty obvious, you have the authority in being the sort of especially when you work with national libraries and archiving specialists. But yes, I'm happy to brainstorm further on this, definitely.
Thank you.
Thanks.